How's everybody doing? Awesome. It's weird because it's like, because of the time change, it's dark, like so early. By the time you guys got here, it was already dark outside, which feels super weird and slightly depressing, but also kind of exciting because it feels like we're out later. But I don't know, things change. Things change. Speaking of things changing, point of obvious fact is that things change. I mean, from time to time, things, you expect to stay the same, just don't. Things change over time. If you guys think about it, you probably don't have the same wardrobe that you had when you were in 5th grade, right? At least I would hope not. One, it would be really small on you, and so that would not be good. And also, hopefully, maybe your style has changed a little bit as you've gotten older, and, sometimes things just change, and that's not a bad thing. Some of you, the music you listen to now is different than it was 3 years ago, right? If you look back at your playlist from like 3 years ago, it would be probably a lot different in some ways than it is right now. You look differently than you did when you were a kid, and how many of you are thankful for that? You kind of grew into your dashingly good looks, right? And you no longer, look like a dweeby little kid. You look like the handsome little butterfly that you are, all grown up. And so good things happen because, sometimes change is necessary. Change is good, and it's one of the guarantees in life that is a constant, is that things will always inevitably change. And there's nothing that we can do about it, and that's okay. But if we're being honest, unlike some of the changes that are just between style or music or whatever, some changes happen that aren't always the greatest thing. Sometimes changes that are unexpected in that we weren't, planning on. Things happen, like maybe a friendship changes, the dynamic changes, and so over time, maybe your lives kind of drifted in different directions, or for whatever reason, maybe there was a spat. I don't know, but for whatever reason, maybe there was a friendship that you can think of that is now different. And maybe just to take it a step further, maybe it's not just a friendship that's changed, but maybe it's your entire friend group that has changed. How many of you just feel like that's just changed a lot? For most people, I grew up in a small school, and I graduated in a class of 43, so it was a really small school. Yeah, some of your eyes like bugged out of your head, but like, there, even in there, like my friend group changed a lot over the years. There were times that I was real close with a certain group of friends, and then I went on to middle school, I went on to high school, and then those friendships changed. We were still around each other at school, but we never hung out. We didn't do the same things. Our extracurriculars changed, and so that just happens sometimes. Maybe you changed location. Maybe you moved, or your parents got a new job, and so you had to change locations, and so that meant new friend group all over again, new district, new school, and so sometimes changes happen, and sometimes they're unexpected. And for most of us, there's nothing scarier than the unknown. So an unexpected change is pretty scary, because how am I going to move forward? What friends am I going to have? Who am I going to depend on? What if I don't make the team moving forward? What if whatever it is? New competition. And sometimes there's so many unexpected things that change, like an injury or unexpected financial challenges, or maybe just getting cut from the team or failing a class. And those changes have to change your perspective, because now you have to work differently. Now you have to approach things from a different angle. It's difficult when unexpected changes happen. And most of us, while all those things can be unexpected and they can be difficult, they're not quite as difficult or core-shaking as they are when it's a change within the very thing that's supposed to be the most constant. And for many of us, that is our family. We're in this series called Family Matters. And sometimes when changes happen within the family, they are the most earth-shattering changes, because our families are the things that are supposed to stay constant. Maybe you've had life experience that teaches you different. Maybe you've had a great home life. But all of us, I think, have this idea that of all the things that change, family is the one thing that you should always be able to count on. It's the one thing that should never change as far as their role in your life to care for you. But maybe things happen. Maybe your parents got divorced. Maybe there was just changes that happened there, and now suddenly the whole dynamic in the house is different. Maybe you had a parent that just moved out or passed away, and now there's a different change in the house. The dynamic is different. Maybe it's something smaller, like if you were me when I was in high school, my dad changed careers, got a different job. And so that stuff is not easy, because it meant different financial challenges. It meant when I went to work at Chick-fil-A, I had to be a little more careful about where that money went, because if I wanted to go on a trip or if I wanted to do something fun, it more than likely had to come out of my pocketbook rather than my parents for a while until my dad got his feet settled in his new career. Maybe you had a different dynamic change in the household because somebody was added to the family or somebody was removed from the family, like an older sibling going off to college. And then that changes the dynamic in the house again. I can't speak to that because I was the first one in the family that left for college because I was the oldest child. So I didn't get to see how that felt back at home. But I did get to experience a new family member coming in because when I was almost 13 years old, my sister was born. So we got used to a dynamic in the family. And then all of a sudden there was not only a fourth kid, but a sister, because I had only had brothers prior to that. No matter what our experience is with change, something about it happening in our families makes it a little bit more difficult, because our family is supposed to be our constant. Our family is supposed to be the place where we can depend on people, where things don't change so much that they change the entire dynamic and trajectory of our lives. So what do we do when there are family changes? And so the passage I want to read from this evening comes from King Solomon. He writes a book called Ecclesiastes. How many of you have ever just read the book of Ecclesiastes? You're like, I don't know what my devotion is going to be today. Let's see. Let's flip open somewhere in the middle. Ecclesiastes. I'll read that, right? I wouldn't have read that had it not been for the fact that I was in Bible Bowl growing up, and we memorized the book of Ecclesiastes for Bible Bowl one year. I couldn't tell you, I couldn't quote all of it anymore, because let's be honest, I crammed it and memorized it to the 2 hours before I had to go and quote it. But and then I forgot it the next day. But it's in there somewhere. And this was one of the passages that actually stuck out to me the most growing up. And when I would read this passage, and it was kind of one of those, why are we studying this book? Because it's depressing. But it was also one of those kind of comforting at the same. You'll see what I mean when we get into this. But Solomon is known as the wisest guy who's ever lived, because he was the son of King David, and he was not the oldest heir to the throne, so he actually wasn't supposed to get the throne. But then, as God often does, he intervenes and he placed Solomon to be the next heir to the throne. And so Solomon comes and enters into the role of king after the legendary King David is finished being king, and he could have asked for anything, but he asks God for wisdom. God gives him wisdom. And at the end of his life, as he's reflecting on all of his experiences, his mistakes and his successes, his failures and his hang-ups, and he writes down in the book of Ecclesiastes how many of us should think about life, how many of us should approach life. And it gives us a little bit of a perspective from a bird's eye view on life in general. It's not so much in the weeds. It's more an overarching view. There's weeds in it for sure, but it's an overarching view of here's some wise things that you should consider when it comes to your life. And this is what Solomon writes in Ecclesiastes chapter 3. He says, there is a time for everything, and a season for every activity under the heavens. A time to be born, and a time to die. A time to plant, and a time to uproot. A time to kill, and a time to heal. A time to tear down, and a time to build. A time to weep, and a time to laugh. A time to mourn, and a time to dance. A time to scatter stones, and a time to gather them. A time to embrace, and a time to refrain from embracing. A time to search, and a time to give up. A time to keep, and a time to throw away. A time to tear down, and a time to mend. A time to be silent, and a time to speak. A time to love, and a time to hate. A time for war, and a time for peace. It's a very poetic way of saying, get ready for the unexpected, because things will change. Everything in this life is kind of measured in seasons. There's times for things. 2020 has been a time for things. It's been a difficult year in a lot of ways. And there's a time for everything. So when it comes to how we process change, Solomon is saying, instead of fighting change or pretending like things will always stay the same, let's open our hands and give control. Some of my mentors growing up always gave me this illustration when I thought about this kind of thing, and when I thought about the idea of control. And ultimately, change is just the realization to us that control is an illusion, that we can't actually control things. And so when we hold on to our plans so tight, when we hold on to what we know and what's comfortable so tight, so that nobody can take it away, so that God can't take that from us, so that our circumstances can't take this from us, when we hold on to everything so tightly, maybe that's our way of saying, no, you can't take this from me. But it also means you can't grab anything else, because your fist is so clenched holding on to what you have. And sometimes we're so desperately afraid of the unknown that we don't unclench our fists long enough to allow God to move in ways that we previously wouldn't have our eyes open to. And Solomon is basically saying this: there's a time for everything, things will change, and God is ultimately in control. So when you open your hands, palm facing up, yeah, things can slip away more easily, but it's okay, because God can put things back in there that you wouldn't have been able to receive otherwise. So while it seems a little bit like a downer when you read a lot of Ecclesiastes, there's actually a lot of really good insight in it. And there's actually reason to have hope, because he's just saying, hey, I'm going to give it to you straight. I'm not going to tell you life is going to be all rainbows and butterflies, because it's not. And Jesus actually talks about this in the Gospels as well. But when the storm comes, when unexpected changes happen, you can depend on God. So open your hands and give him the control. In the book of Isaiah, he takes another kind of approach to this. Now, Isaiah was written in a time where the nation of Israel was undergoing a pretty difficult time. So there's some differing opinions on whether or not Isaiah was written before or during or after, or a mixture of all three, during the exile into Babylon. But a little bit of history in the nation of Israel is, it kind of started in the Genesis with Abraham and God promising him that he's going to make a great nation. That nation became the nation of Israel. They underwent slavery in Egypt. God delivered them, gave them the 10 Commandments. They wandered in the desert because they were disobedient. They begin their own nation. God appoints judges over them, and they rule. But then Israel says, we want a king like all the other nations. God says, it's going to be bad news, but I'll give you what you want if you won't listen to me. And they said, give us what we want. And they don't listen to him. So God gives them kings. The kings fail because they're human. And then other nations overtake them. And ultimately, the kingdom divides into the northern and the southern kingdom with a string of really bad kings. And then some good kings, but then a lot of really bad kings. And then Isaiah warns them, because listen, you've been doing this pattern for generations where you've been ignoring God and trying to go your own way, and it's going to come back to bite you. You are going to be taken captive, and this is what happens. This is what happens. And if you read even in the book of Daniel, Jeremiah even is around this time period. In the book of Daniel, we've studied it about a year or two ago in this room for high school. And in the book of Daniel, this is when, the Babylonian captivity happens. God allows the nation, the empire of Babylon, to come and to take them captive and to uproot them from their homeland. He takes back people to be warriors and changes their name, changes their language, changes their education, changes their gods into Babylonian gods. And the nation of Israel is in shambles. They don't own themselves. They are owned by the Babylonian Empire. And so Isaiah is warning about this, but he comes also with a message of hope and reminding them to remain faithful because God is still with them. This is what he says in Isaiah chapter 43, verse 2. He says, when, not if, notice that. He says, when you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And when you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you. When you walk through fire, you will not be burned. The flames will not set you ablaze. And basically, in every moment and in every season, when things change, including when your family, when it changes. Daniel's family, during this Babylonian captivity, he was taken away from his family. So he understands a thing or two about your family dynamic being changed a little bit. In the midst of all of that, God will be with us. And what's ironic, what's interesting about this, says when you walk through the fire, you will not be burnt, the flames will not set you ablaze. Literally in the book of Daniel, in chapter 2, it tells the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. If any of you have grown up and then watching VeggieTales, you've seen the vegetables being thrown in the furnace and nothing happened. Anyway, I'm a 90s kid, so VeggieTales is in my head when it comes to these old Bible stories. But if you read Daniel chapter 2, you see this very thing play out. Nebuchadnezzar tells them to bow down to his statue. And they say, no, we only have one God. And he's more powerful than you. Well, he doesn't like that. So he throws them into this furnace. And what happens? Because of their faith, God saves them. They literally go through the fire. A fire so hot, 7 times hotter than it originally was, that it was killing the people that threw them into the furnace. That's how hot it was. But they were not burned. They walked out the other side, and Nebuchadnezzar eventually becomes a man of faith. It's kind of a crazy story. If you read the book of Daniel, especially the first 6 chapters, it's kind of mind-blowing. But you see that when you go through hard times, when times changes, because there's a time for everything, God will be with you. And I don't think there's a more appropriate time to study that in a year where it's kind of been a lot of unrest, a lot of changes. But if there's one thing I would want you to take away from tonight's message as you guys start your week back up and go back into your routines, and for many of you going back to school twice as much this week as you've been going, then I would encourage you to remember this, that when your family changes, your mindset matters. Because the reality is we can't change. Change will happen. But your mindset going into it and coming through it will make a big difference in your perspective and in the way that you're able to handle it and go through it. So how would I encourage you to live this out this week? Here's a couple things that I would say to work on. One is to understand, again, that change will happen. Change will happen, and there's nothing that we can do about it. So remember that in the midst of those changes, just like Isaiah promised the nation of Israel back then, the same promises are true for us today, that when you go through change, God promises that he will be with us. In fact, Jesus echoes this. He says in the book of John, he says, don't be afraid when darkness happens and overcomes you, but don't be afraid, because I have overcome the world and I will be with you. And Jesus promises us the very same thing. God will be with us. We can't stop change from happening, but we can understand that he is with us. And just to kind of tie both of those points together, trust that God can use the change to change you. Oftentimes, many of us, when we're comfortable in the known, when we're comfortable in our kind of routine and ways of doing things, we stop listening to God because we've got it figured out, right? But it's only in those moments when things change, when we're put in vulnerability, when we're put in uncomfortable situations, when we're put in situations where we have to really question our foundation, because even maybe our own family dynamic is changing and it feels like we have no foundation under us, to trust that God can use that opportunity to change you and to change you for the better. If there's any theme that we see throughout Scripture, it's that God can take beautiful things from the ashes. He can take things that seem hopeless and turn them into the most hopeful of situations. So trust that God can use the change in your life to change you if you are open to that. Without question, change is difficult. New season, new house, new town, new family members, new normal, whatever it is, especially when it comes to family matters. Change happens and it's not always easy. Many of us know this firsthand. But God promises he's with us. And you do have a family. Some of us, what we're going to talk about next week is some of us have people that are not blood-related family, but we would consider them family, wouldn't we? Because we're that close to them. And that's what we're going to dive into a little bit as we wrap this series up next week. But the reality is you do have a family, and what we strive to do is to make places like this a place that can be safe for you guys and a place that can be a foundation for you. You got people here who have been ahead of you in life, who care about you. You got peers who are hopefully all working towards the same goal and drawing closer to God and building a stronger faith. A faith that is not spoon-fed to you, but a faith that is sustainable through the storms of life. A faith that has roots that go deep, that can withstand the strong winds of change. And so I encourage you in your group time to be vulnerable. To allow yourself to be real with your peers and with your group leader. And I can promise you, if you've got stuff that's going on, You can always pull your small group leader aside afterwards. I don't know if they tell you this all the time, but I know from conversations I have from them and from knowing their hearts, that I know that if you ever had anything that you would want to talk about that you're not comfortable sharing in front of your entire group, they've got your back and they care about you. So I would encourage you to remember that God is with us, and sometimes he's with us in the form of other relationships. And he uses those relationships and the conversations that happen to move and to speak to us. So remember that when your family changes, your mindset matters. So let's ask God for the strength and the grace to help us get our mindsets in the right place. I want to pray, and then we'll divide up into our small groups.